Nebraska Territory, 1868. The wind howled across the plains like a wild beast, tearing at the canvas wagon cover and sending tremors through the wooden frame. Victoria James clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her 20-year-old face drawn with exhaustion and grief. 3 fresh graves marked the earth behind her, mother, father, and younger brother, all claimed by the fever within a week of each other. The wagon train would continue west at dawn, without her. "Cannot spare the resources for a woman alone," the wagon master had declared. His eyes had held pity, but his voice remained firm. "Nearest town is Clearwater, 2 days south. Best chance you got." Victoria stared at the distant horizon where the sun melted into the earth. Her pale blue dress, once her Sunday best, now hung loose on her frame after weeks of sparse rations. Her long blonde hair whipped in the relentless wind, strands escaping the practical braid she maintained despite everything. The last of the family money had purchased a mule and basic supplies, barely enough to reach this Clearwater place if she could find it. The frontier was no place for a woman alone, everyone knew that. Only families survived out here, with men to hunt and protect, women to cook and mend. A solitary female was merely prey waiting to be devoured by the wilderness or worse. Victoria had always believed this truth, had seen evidence of it on their journey west. Now she was that woman, that prey. The cruel joke of it all was that they had been headed toward a new beginning. Her father had claimed land sight unseen, promised fertile soil and opportunity. Instead, all she inherited was a deed to property she'd never reach and 3 fresh mounds of earth that would soon be erased by the elements. When morning came, Victoria stood stoically as the wagon train pulled away, keeping her tears private until the dust settled. Then she hoisted herself onto her mule, clutching the crude map the wagon master had sketched, and pointed south toward the unknown. 2 days later, her water nearly gone and the sun beating mercilessly upon her fair skin, Victoria spotted a thin column of smoke in the distance. Her heart lurched with hope as she urged the tired mule forward. As she drew closer, she could make out a single structure, not a town, but a small cabin with a corral beside it. She approached cautiously, remembering her father's warnings about strangers. The cabin door swung open before she reached it, and a young man stepped out, rifle in hand but not raised. "State your business," he called, his voice neither friendly nor hostile. Victoria swallowed hard, her throat parched. "I seek Clearwater. I was told it was in this direction." The man stepped further into the light, and Victoria was struck by his appearance. He couldn't be much older than 25, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and keen blue eyes studying her with cautious interest. Unlike the grizzled men she'd encountered on the trail, his face was clean-shaven save for a hint of stubble along his jaw. His frame was lean but strong, evidenced by the way he handled the rifle with easy familiarity. "Clearwater's still a day's ride south," he replied, his gaze taking in her bedraggled state. "You look ready to drop." "Traveling alone." Victoria nodded, suddenly aware of how vulnerable her admission made her. "My family, we were traveling west, they took ill. I'm headed to Clearwater to seek employment." Something in the man's expression shifted, not pity, which Victoria had come to despise, but understanding. "Name's Lucas Yates," he said, lowering his rifle. "Got water for your mule and something warm inside if you've a mind to rest before continuing." Victoria hesitated. Accepting help from a strange man went against everything she'd been taught. But the alternative was pushing on with depleted supplies and failing strength. "Victoria James," she responded, sliding carefully from the mule's back, her legs nearly buckling after so many hours riding. "I would be grateful for water, at least." Lucas nodded, keeping a respectful distance as he led her mule to the water trough. "Storm's coming in," he observed, nodding toward the darkening western sky. "You'd be welcome to wait it out in the barn. I wouldn't advise continuing today." As if confirming his words, thunder rumbled in the distance. Victoria glanced anxiously at the horizon, then back at this unexpected host. "I wouldn't wish to impose," she began, though the prospect of shelter was desperately appealing. "No imposition," Lucas replied matter-of-factly. "Got plenty of space in the barn." Safer than being caught in the open when that hits. Within an hour, the storm had descended with biblical fury. Wind screamed around the corners of the barn where Victoria had been settled with blankets, a lantern, and a tin plate of beans and salt pork that, despite their simplicity, were the most satisfying meal she'd had in weeks. Lucas had been true to his word, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring her comfort. He'd told her briefly that he worked as a cowhand for the Circle M Ranch, looking after this line cabin during calving season. His easy manner and straightforward kindness began to ease Victoria's wariness, though she remained cautious. "Been out here 3 years," he explained as they sat near the barn door, watching the storm's progress. "Came west after the war. Didn't have much waiting for me back in Missouri." "You fought?" Victoria asked, noting he would have been barely 20 when the conflict ended. Lucas nodded, a shadow crossing his features. "Last 2 years. Saw enough to last a lifetime." He seemed disinclined to elaborate, and Victoria didn't press. "Everyone out here carried ghosts." "My father was a furniture maker in Pennsylvania," she offered instead. "He believed the stories about free land and new beginnings, sold everything to come west." "And now?" Lucas asked gently. Victoria stared into the stormy darkness. "Now I have a deed to land I'll never see, skills that aren't much use out here, and no family left to speak of." She hadn't meant to sound so bitter, but the words spilled out before she could temper them. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "Frontier's hard," he finally said. "Takes more than it gives most times, but sometimes—" He trailed off, gazing toward the main house where a single lamp burned. "Sometimes it offers something you weren't expecting." The storm raged through the night and into the next day. Lucas insisted Victoria rest another night before continuing, and she found herself reluctantly grateful. Her body needed the recovery time, and despite her initial fears, she felt safer in this stranger's barn than she had since leaving the wagon train. On the morning of the third day, Victoria prepared to depart. Lucas appeared with a parcel of food and a small canteen. "For the road," he said simply. Then, with some hesitation, "Clearwater's not much of a town, few buildings, fewer decent folks. If you're looking for honest work," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Circle M's main house is 10 miles east of town. Owner's wife been looking for household help. Might be worth asking." Victoria thanked him for the information, suddenly reluctant to leave this brief haven. "You've shown me great kindness, Mr. Yates." "Lucas," he corrected with a small smile that transformed his serious face. "And out here kindness isn't charity, it's survival. Someone did the same for me once." With directions to both Clearwater and the Circle M Ranch carefully memorized, Victoria set out. The prairie stretched before her, vast and indifferent, but somehow less threatening than before. Clearwater proved to be exactly as Lucas had described, a sorry collection of buildings centered around a dusty main street. The saloon appeared to be the most prosperous business, followed by a general store with faded goods in the window. Victoria drew stares as she rode through, men's gazes lingering in ways that made her spine stiffen. The boarding house was a 2-story structure badly in need of paint. The proprietress, a hard-faced woman with suspicious eyes, named a weekly rate that would deplete Victoria's meager funds within days. "Looking for work," Victoria explained, clutching her carpet bag. The woman snorted. "Ain't much respectable work for single women here, less you can teach. School's been without a teacher for months." Victoria had attended school until 16, but had no training as a teacher. "I can sew, cook, keep accounts." "Saloon's hiring," the woman interrupted with a knowing look. "Always hiring pretty girls." Victoria stiffened. "I meant respectable work." "Then you're in the wrong town, girl." 2 days later, with her funds dwindling and no prospects in sight, Victoria found herself riding east toward the Circle M Ranch. Lucas had been right about Clearwater. The men were forward, the women suspicious, and the only work offered had been of the sort that would have scandalized her parents. The Circle M main house appeared on the horizon by mid-afternoon, a substantial 2-story structure with outbuildings and corrals spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Victoria straightened her dress and smoothed her hair before approaching, conscious of her threadbare appearance. A woman in her 40s emerged onto the porch as Victoria dismounted, her expression curious rather than unwelcoming. "Good day," Victoria called, summoning her courage. "I was told you might be seeking household help. I'm Victoria James." The woman, Margaret Miller, wife of the ranch owner, studied Victoria with shrewd eyes. "Who told you we needed help?" "Lucas Yates," Victoria answered. "He mans your line cabin to the north." Something in Mrs. Miller's face softened. "Lucas, is it? Well, that boy doesn't speak much, but when he does, it's worth listening." She gestured Victoria forward. "Come in then, let's talk about what you can do." By sundown, Victoria had secured not only employment but lodging in a small room off the kitchen. The pay was modest but fair, the work familiar enough, and Mrs. Miller seemed a reasonable employer. For the first time since burying her family, Victoria felt the crushing weight of uncertainty lift slightly. 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine. Victoria rose before dawn to help with breakfast, spent her days cleaning, mending, and assisting with whatever tasks Mrs. Miller assigned. The ranch hands treated her with polite distance, all except for Ethan, the foreman's son, whose attention became increasingly pointed and unwelcome. "Pretty girl like you shouldn't waste away in a kitchen," he remarked one afternoon, cornering Victoria as she hung laundry. His 28 years had hardened him in ways that made her uncomfortable. "I'm quite content with my position," she replied stiffly, trying to move past him. Ethan stepped closer. "Could be better positioned as a foreman's wife. My cabin's small but comfortable." "I'm not seeking a husband," Victoria stated firmly, though she knew such directness might cost her. Women on the frontier couldn't afford to refuse potential security. Ethan's expression darkened, mighty particular for an orphan with no prospects. The encounter left Victoria shaken. She'd escaped one threat only to find another. Perhaps the frontier truly was no place for a woman alone. Every interaction seemed to reinforce this belief. Spring brought new activity to the ranch as cattle needed moving, calves needed branding, and the rhythm of ranch life accelerated. Victoria found herself working from dawn till well after dusk, falling into exhausted sleep each night. Though Ethan continued his unwanted attention, the constant activity provided some buffer against his advances. It was early May when Victoria encountered Lucas again. She was returning from the spring house with butter for supper when she spotted a familiar figure dismounting near the bunkhouse. Her heart gave an unexpected leap of recognition. Lucas saw her at almost the same moment, surprise and then pleasure crossing his face. "Miss James," he greeted, touching his hat brim, "you found the place then." "Thanks to your directions," she replied, suddenly conscious of her work-worn dress and loose wisps of hair. "Mrs. Miller hired me on the spot." "Glad to hear it." His smile was brief but genuine. "Been back at the line cabin these past weeks, spring's busy time." Victoria nodded, oddly tongue-tied in his presence. Something about Lucas Yates unsettled her in a way entirely different from Ethan's unwanted attention. Lucas treated her with respect that felt sincere rather than calculated. "Mr. Miller's called all the hands in," Lucas explained. "Big drive starting next week. Northern herd needs moving to summer pasture." "Will you be going with them?" Victoria asked before she could stop herself. "For part of it." "Someone's needed back at the line cabin, though." He studied her for a moment. "You're looking better than when I found you. Less." He seemed to search for the right word. "Desperate," Victoria supplied with a small, rueful smile. "I was going to say haunted," Lucas corrected gently, "though there's still shadows there." His observation, delivered without judgment, pierced something in Victoria's carefully maintained composure. No one at the ranch had acknowledged her grief, her loss, the circumstances that had brought her here. They saw only her capability, her usefulness. "The shadows remain," she admitted quietly. "But having purpose helps." Lucas nodded as if he understood completely. "Purpose is what saved me after the war, that and good people who saw past what I'd been through." He glanced toward the main house. "Better get this report to Mr. Miller. Good evening, Miss James." As he walked away, Victoria realized she had been clutching the butter crock so tightly her fingers had left imprints in the wooden lid. The cattle drive preparations created a frenzied atmosphere around the ranch. Victoria found herself cooking enormous meals for hungry cowboys, mending torn shirts and worn socks, and helping Mrs. Miller prepare provisions for the men on the trail. Lucas appeared occasionally in the kitchen or yard, always polite, often quiet, but Victoria became increasingly aware of his presence, and of his gaze occasionally seeking hers. 3 days before the drive was to begin, disaster struck. Victoria was hanging sheets when she heard shouts from the corral. Running to see, she found a crowd gathered around a fallen figure. Lucas lay in the dirt, face contorted in pain, as the ranch hands carefully examined his leg. "Darn Mustang threw him against the fence post," someone explained. "Legs broken for sure." "Mister." Miller pushed through the crowd, assessed the situation with one glance, and began issuing orders. "Get him to the bunkhouse. Send for Doc Wilson from town." Victoria watched helplessly as they carried Lucas away, his normally tanned face ashen with pain. The drive couldn't be delayed. Hundreds of cattle needed to reach summer pasture, but a man with a broken leg couldn't ride. Later that evening, after the doctor had set Lucas's leg and departed, Mrs. Miller summoned Victoria to the parlor. "Lucas can't stay in the bunkhouse," she explained. "Too much commotion with the men coming and going. Doctor says he needs quiet and rest for that leg to heal properly." Victoria nodded, wondering why she was being told this. "We're converting the old sewing room by the kitchen," Mrs. Miller continued. "He'll stay there during his recovery. I'll need you to tend to him, meals, changing bandages, whatever's required." Doctor left instructions. Victoria felt a flutter of alarm. Wouldn't it be more appropriate for one of the men to care for him? Mrs. Miller's expression was pragmatic. "The men are needed for the drive. Besides, nursing is women's work. Lucas is a good man. He won't give you any trouble." And so it was decided. Lucas was installed in the small room adjacent to the kitchen, his broken leg properly splinted and bandaged, with strict instructions to remain abed for at least 2 weeks. The cattle drive departed the next morning, leaving the ranch oddly quiet with most of the hands gone. Victoria approached her new nursing duties with trepidation. Being alone with a man, even one as seemingly honorable as Lucas, went against every convention she'd been raised with. Yet circumstances demanded practicality over propriety. "I've brought your breakfast," she announced the first morning, entering his room with a tray. Lucas struggled to sit up, grimacing with pain. "You shouldn't have to play nursemaid, Miss James." "Mrs. Miller assigned me the task," Victoria replied, setting the tray on the bedside table. "And please call me Victoria. Miss James seems overly formal when I'm helping you with meals." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Victoria then, and thank you." The first days established a routine. Victoria brought meals, helped change bandages under Mrs. Miller's supervision, and provided books from Mr. Miller's library to help pass the time. Lucas proved to be a patient invalid, rarely complaining despite obvious discomfort. Their conversations, initially stilted and formal, gradually eased into something more natural. Victoria found herself lingering after delivering meals, first for minutes, then for half hours as they discussed books or exchanged stories. Lucas spoke of his family in Missouri, parents lost to illness before the war, a sister married and moved to California. Victoria shared memories of Pennsylvania, of her father's workshop and mother's garden. "Do you ever regret coming west?" Lucas asked one evening as Victoria sat mending by the lamplight near his bed. Victoria's needle paused mid-stitch. "That's a complicated question." "I've got nothing but time for complicated answers," he replied. Victoria considered her response carefully. "I regret the losses, my family, our dreams," she resumed stitching. "But regret is a luxury that doesn't change anything. The frontier is unforgiving that way." "Is that what you believe? That the frontier only takes?" Victoria looked up, meeting his intent gaze. "Isn't that what experience teaches? My family came seeking new beginnings and found only graves. Women alone are viewed as either burdens or—" Opportunities, she couldn't quite keep the bitterness from her voice. Lucas was quiet for a moment. I thought the same once. After the war I was broken, inside where it doesn't show. Came west believing I'd either find redemption or a quick end. His voice grew softer. Found neither exactly, instead found purpose. People who judged me on what I could contribute, not what I'd been. And that was enough, Victoria asked, genuinely curious. For a long time, yes, his eyes held hers. Now I'm not so sure. Something shifted in the air between them, a current Victoria wasn't prepared to acknowledge. She rose quickly, gathering her mending. You should rest. Dr. Wilson would be displeased if I tired his patient with philosophical debates. Lucas didn't press, but his gaze followed her to the door. Good night, Victoria. Good night, Lucas. As the days passed, Victoria found herself increasingly drawn to their conversations. Lucas possessed a thoughtfulness she hadn't encountered in others at the ranch. He asked questions that made her examine her own beliefs and listen to her answers as if they mattered. What will you do when your contract here ends? He asked one afternoon. Victoria glanced up from the book she'd been reading aloud. I haven't thought that far ahead. Haven't you? His tone was gently challenging. A woman who survived what you did surely plans her next steps. Victoria closed the book, marking her place with a finger. My options are limited. I could seek another position as a housekeeper or companion, perhaps save enough to open a small boarding house in a more established town. She sighed. The truth is, women alone have few respectable choices on the frontier. What about your family's land claim? Victoria shook her head. A fantasy. I couldn't possibly develop it alone, and I have no funds to hire help. You could marry, Lucas suggested, his expression carefully neutral. For convenience, Victoria's tone sharpened. Become some man's property in exchange for protection, like Ethan proposes. Lucas's eyebrows rose. Ethan's been making proposals. Victoria flushed, realizing she'd revealed more than intended. Not formal ones, merely suggestions that I'd be better off as his wife than as a servant. Lucas's jaw tightened. And what do you think of his suggestions? I think I'd rather remain a servant than marry without. She trailed off, suddenly conscious of the direction of their conversation. Without, Lucas prompted quietly. Without affection at the very least, Victoria finished, her cheeks warm. My parents had a love match, rare in their social circle, but they were happier for it. I saw what that looked like. Lucas studied her for a long moment. That's not a foolish standard, despite what frontier practicality might dictate. Their gazes held until Victoria, unnerved by the intensity in his blue eyes, returned to the book. Shall I continue reading? By the third week, Lucas was permitted to move about with crutches, giving him limited mobility around the house. Victoria continued to bring his meals, but their interactions now extended beyond his sick room. They might sit on the back porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the prairie in golds and purples. Or Lucas would keep Victoria company in the kitchen as she prepared bread for the following day. Mrs. Miller observed their growing camaraderie with knowing eyes, but made no comment beyond ensuring propriety was maintained. The few remaining ranch hands were too busy with daily tasks to pay much attention to the convalescent cowboy and the quiet housekeeper. One evening, as Victoria chopped vegetables for stew, Lucas mentioned casually, Doc says I can return to light duties next week. Desk work, accounts, nothing on horseback yet. Victoria's knife paused momentarily. That's good news. You must be eager to return to your normal routine. Parts of it, Lucas agreed, though I've grown accustomed to certain new routines as well. Victoria glanced up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Change is the only constant on the frontier, she said lightly, returning to her chopping. Victoria, Lucas began, then hesitated. I've been meaning to ask. The kitchen door burst open as Mrs. Miller entered with an armload of linens. Victoria, we need to prepare the spare bedroom. Ethan's just ridden in to say Mr. Miller's bringing a buyer back tomorrow. important cattle buyer from Chicago looking to purchase a substantial herd. The moment between Victoria and Lucas dissolved as domestic preparations took precedence. Whatever Lucas had intended to ask remained unspoken. The cattle buyer's arrival brought renewed activity to the ranch house. Mr. Samuel Walsh was a portly, prosperous-looking man in his 50s, accompanied by a younger associate who seemed to function primarily as his note-taker. Their presence meant additional cooking and cleaning for Victoria, with little time for private conversations with Lucas. At dinner the first evening, Walsh dominated the conversation with stories of Chicago's growth and recovery after the Great Fire. "Opportunity everywhere for those with vision," he declared, accepting another helping of Victoria's roast beef. "And the demand for quality beef grows by the day." Mr. Miller nodded eagerly. "Circle M raises the finest cattle in the territory. Our breeding stock is selected personally." The conversation continued in this vein until Mrs. Miller smoothly directed it toward more general topics. Victoria moved quietly around the table, refilling glasses and removing plates, conscious of Lucas's presence at the far end. As temporary bookkeeper during his recovery, he had been included in the formal dinner. "Your housekeeper sets an excellent table," Walsh remarked to Mrs. Miller, not bothering to address Victoria directly though she stood nearby. "Hard to find good help these days, especially out here in the wilderness." "Miss James is indeed a treasure, Mrs. Miller replied pointedly. "We're fortunate she chose to join our household." Walsh turned, seeming to notice Victoria properly for the first time. His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl despite her modest dress. "Indeed, a young woman of your appearance must have had other options. What brings you to this remote outpost, Miss James?" Victoria maintained her composure with effort. "Opportunity, Mr. Walsh. As you said, it exists for those who seek it." "Clever as well as decorative," Walsh commented with a chuckle that his associate nervously echoed. "Though surely a woman's greatest opportunity lies in securing a suitable husband." Before Victoria could formulate a response that wouldn't jeopardize her position, Lucas spoke from his end of the table. "Miss James's considerable skills make her valuable far beyond any matrimonial prospects," he said, his tone deceptively mild though his eyes had hardened. "The frontier needs competent women building communities, not merely adorning them." An uncomfortable silence fell. Walsh looked briefly taken aback before offering a forced laugh. Of course, no offense intended." Mrs. Miller smoothly changed the subject, but Victoria felt the weight of Lucas's gaze as she continued her duties. He had defended her publicly to an important business connection. The significance wasn't lost on her. Later that night, after the household had retired, Victoria slipped out to the back porch for a moment of solitude. The evening's interactions had left her unsettled, reminding her of her precarious position in frontier society. "Couldn't sleep," Lucas's voice came quietly from the shadows. Victoria started slightly. "I thought everyone had retired." "Too restless," he admitted, moving into the moonlight. He had abandoned one crutch but still leaned heavily on the other. "I wanted to apologize if I spoke out of turn at dinner." Victoria shook her head. "There's no need, your words were appreciated." Lucas moved closer, his face serious in the silvery light. Walsh's type sees the frontier as something to be conquered and exploited, including its women. "And how do you see it?" Victoria asked, suddenly needing to know. Lucas considered his answer carefully. "As a place that strips away pretense, shows who you really are, what truly matters." His gaze met hers. "A harsh teacher, but an honest one." "And what has it taught you?" Victoria's voice had softened, almost without her realizing. "That survival alone isn't living," Lucas replied. "That purpose without connection is an empty achievement." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "that sometimes what you're looking for finds you when you've stopped searching." The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken meaning. Victoria found herself unable to look away from his face, seeing there a vulnerability that matched her own. "Lucas," she began, unsure what she meant to say. A sound from inside the house broke the moment, a door closing, footsteps in the hall. Victoria stepped back, suddenly aware of how their conversation might appear to others. "I should go in," she said reluctantly. "Morning comes early." Lucas nodded, understanding the practicalities that governed their world. "Good night, Victoria." "Good night, Lucas." Walsh's visit extended for 3 days as he toured the ranch, inspected cattle, and negotiated terms with Mr. Miller. Victoria maintained her distance as much as possible, uncomfortable with the way the businessman's gaze followed her when he thought no one was watching. On the third evening, as Victoria carried linens to the laundry room, Walsh appeared in the hallway, blocking her path. "Miss James," he greeted, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just the person I hoped to encounter." Victoria clutched the linens tighter. "Mr. Walsh, if you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." "Surely your employers can spare you for a brief conversation." He moved closer, backing Victoria against the wall. "I've been observing you these past days. A woman of your quality is wasted in domestic service." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. "I find my position quite satisfactory." Walsh chuckled, reaching out to touch a strand of hair that had escaped her practical bun. "I maintain a substantial household in Chicago. My housekeeper is aging, soon to retire. The position would include private quarters, generous wages, and certain additional considerations for someone who understands the value of mutual accommodation." His meaning couldn't have been clearer had he stated it explicitly. Victoria felt ill. "I appreciate the offer but must decline," she said firmly, trying to step around him. Walsh's hand shot out, gripping her arm. "Don't be hasty, my dear. The frontier offers few options for women alone. I'm offering security, comfort, even some degree of status." She said no. Lucas's voice, hard as iron, came from the end of the hallway. He stood there, leaning on his crutch, his expression dangerously calm. Walsh didn't release Victoria's arm immediately. "This is a private conversation, Yates." "Not anymore," Lucas replied evenly. "Take your hand off her." Something in his tone, perhaps the quiet certainty of a man who had faced worse threats than an overbearing businessman, caused Walsh to reconsider. He released Victoria's arm, stepping back with forced joviality. "Simply a business proposal, nothing more. No need for territorial displays." Lucas didn't respond to Walsh directly, instead addressing Victoria. "Mrs. Miller was asking for you in the kitchen." Grateful for the excuse, Victoria hurried past Walsh without another word. As she passed Lucas, their eyes met briefly, his conveying a silent question about her well-being. She gave a small nod before continuing toward the kitchen. Later that night, Victoria couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the hallway encounter. Walsh's proposition had been vile but not surprising. Such were the realities for women in her position. What lingered in her thoughts was Lucas's intervention, the controlled anger in his voice, the protective stance despite his injury. Dawn was breaking when Victoria heard commotion in the front yard. Looking out her small window, she saw Walsh and his associate loading their luggage into a wagon, preparing for an unexpectedly early departure. Mr. Miller stood nearby, his body language stiff and formal rather than the eager hospitality of previous days. At breakfast, Mrs. Miller explained tersely that the cattle deal had fallen through due to irreconcilable differences of opinion. Victoria wondered what had transpired after her encounter with Walsh, but knew better than to ask directly. With the visitors gone, the ranch settled back into its routine. Lucas continued his recovery, now spending mornings at the ranch office reviewing accounts and afternoons exercising his healing leg as prescribed by the doctor. Victoria resumed her normal duties, their interactions necessarily limited by their respective responsibilities. A week after Walsh's departure, Victoria was hanging laundry when she noticed Lucas walking carefully around the corral, testing his strength without the crutch. His progress pleased her, though she pushed aside the thought that his complete recovery would mean his return to the line cabin miles away. That evening, as Victoria sat on the back porch shelling peas, Lucas joined her, lowering himself carefully to the step beside her. Doc says another 2 weeks and I can ride again, he remarked, picking up a pod to help. That's wonderful news, Victoria replied, trying to inject genuine pleasure into her voice despite the hollow feeling the information created. You must be eager to return to normal work. Lucas nodded, his fingers deftly opening pods, though I've been thinking about what normal should look like going forward. Victoria glanced at him questioningly. Mr. Miller offered me a promotion, Lucas continued. Assistant foreman position, based here at the main ranch rather than the line cabin. Are you going to accept? Victoria asked, careful to keep her tone neutral despite the sudden leap of her pulse. I'm considering it. Lucas focused intently on the pea pod in his hands. Would depend on certain factors. Such as? Lucas set aside the peas, turning to face her directly. Such as whether there might be reasons to prefer the main ranch over the solitude I'm accustomed to. Victoria's hands stilled, the implication of his words slowly taking shape in her mind. Solitude has its advantages, she said cautiously. Safety, predictability. And its costs, Lucas added softly. Emptiness, the silence that's so complete you can hear your own heart withering. His raw honesty cut through Victoria's carefully maintained defenses. Is that how you felt, out there alone? Not until recently, Lucas admitted. For years, solitude was a refuge, a place to rebuild after the war left me hollowed out. His eyes held hers. Then a half-starved woman with more courage than sense rode up to my cabin, and suddenly solitude started feeling less like peace and more like absence. Victoria's breath caught. Lucas. Let me finish, he said gently. I've been rehearsing this speech for weeks. A brief, self-deprecating smile crossed his face. Victoria, I know you came west with different dreams, lost everything and had to rebuild from nothing. Believe me, I understand that journey. He reached tentatively for her hand and Victoria allowed him to take it, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I can't replace what you lost, Lucas continued. Wouldn't presume to try. But I can offer partnership, a life built together rather than separately, not from necessity or convenience, but because I've grown to admire and respect you. Because the thought of returning to that cabin without having spoken these words would haunt me. Victoria stared at their joined hands, emotions warring within her. Fear of more loss, cautious hope, the undeniable warmth that Lucas's presence had gradually kindled in her long-dormant heart. The frontier is no place for a woman alone, she said quietly, repeating the belief that had governed her actions for so long. That's what I've always been told, what experience seemed to confirm. Lucas waited, giving her space to continue. But perhaps, Victoria added slowly, raising her eyes to his, it's no place for anyone alone. Perhaps that's the frontier's harshest lesson and its greatest gift, that survival requires connection. Hope brightened Lucas's gaze. Is that a yes? Victoria smiled, the expression feeling strangely unfamiliar on her face after so many months of grief and struggle. It's a recognition that what I thought I wanted, mere security and survival, isn't what I need. And what do you need? Lucas asked, his voice dropping lower. A chance to build something genuine, Victoria answered honestly. Not just exist, but live, with someone who sees me as I am, not as property or convenience. Lucas's free hand rose to gently touch her cheek. I see you, Victoria James. Have since that first day when you were half dead from exhaustion, but still sat straight-backed on that mule, pride intact. Victoria leaned slightly into his touch, allowing herself this vulnerability. Then yes, Lucas Yates. Yes to partnership, to building something together. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Victoria felt something shift inside her, as if a weight she'd carried since her family's deaths had finally begun to lighten. Mrs. Miller will be unsurprised, she said with a small laugh. I believe she suspected my feelings for weeks. Lucas grinned, the expression transforming his serious face. Mr. Miller outright asked my intentions 2 days ago. Said he'd never seen me talk so much as when you're in the room. Their laughter mingled in the evening air, the simple joy of shared understanding, a balm to wounds both visible and hidden. 2 months later, Victoria stood beside Lucas before the traveling preacher who visited the ranch quarterly. Her dress was new, sewn from fabric Mrs. Miller had insisted on ordering from Denver. Lucas wore his best shirt, his face freshly shaven, his eyes never leaving hers as they spoke their vows. The wedding was small but genuinely celebratory. The ranch hands had constructed a pavilion for dancing, and Mrs. Miller had overseen a feast that would be remembered for seasons to come. Victoria, who had expected to feel like an outsider at her own wedding, instead found herself surrounded by people who had become, improbably, a kind of family. As twilight deepened into night, Lucas led his bride toward the small cabin they would share on the ranch's edge. Not the distant line cabin, but a comfortable dwelling close enough for Lucas to fulfill his new duties while offering the privacy a newly married couple required. Victoria paused at the threshold, suddenly overcome by the journey that had brought her here. Less than a year ago, she had stood beside 3 fresh graves, certain that everything worth having had been buried with her family. Now, impossibly, she stood on the threshold of a new beginning with a man whose quiet strength had helped her rediscover her own. Having second thoughts, Lucas asked gently, noting her hesitation. Victoria shook her head. Reflecting on the path that led here, how everything I believed about the frontier has been both confirmed and contradicted. Lucas raised an eyebrow questioningly. It is harsh, Victoria explained, unforgiving of weakness, demanding more than seems possible to give. She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. But it also offers a kind of rebirth, the chance to discover who you truly are when everything familiar is stripped away. And who are you, Victoria Yates? Lucas asked, his use of her new name sending a warmth through her. Victoria smiled, stepping across the threshold into their home. A woman who lost everything but found something unexpected in its place, who came west seeking land but found belonging instead. Lucas followed her inside, closing the door on the vast prairie beyond. In the lamplight, their shadows merged against the cabin wall, no longer separate silhouettes but a single, united form. "Welcome home," he said simply, the words carrying all the promise the frontier had once held for her family, but with a wisdom born of hard experience. Victoria reached up to touch his face, memorizing its contours. "Home isn't the place," she said softly. "It's the belonging, and I belong with you." As Lucas drew her into his embrace, Victoria finally understood the frontier's paradoxical nature, its capacity to strip away everything while offering the possibility of rebuilding something truer. She had lost a family and found another, lost a destination and found a path, lost certainty and found faith. The girl without a place to call home had found acceptance with her cowboy, and in doing so had discovered that home was never about the place at all.